So in response to some of the criticisms of my first video on this topic of trans people in sports, I went ahead and looked even further into some of the studies in question, including the ones that were on the other side of the argument, as I was told I had not done before. I did mention this study in one of my videos about the rebuttals, but it's important to note this is the study that one of the studies that was provided that I pointed out was obviously untrue, but the reason it was untrue is because it was published in 2016 on October 3rd. But it says, Sport and Transgender People, a systematic review of the literature relating to sport participation and competitive sport policies. This was in the Sports Medicine Journal here, NCBI. I'll give a link to it in my description. This study basically was they went about reading 8 research articles and 31 sport policies, and they reviewed them to try to come to some kind of conclusion about this. And what they said was, currently there is no direct or consistent research suggesting transgender female individuals or male individuals have an athletic advantage at any stage of their transition. Cross-sex hormones, gender-confirming surgery, and therefore competitive sport policies that place restrictions on transgender people need to be considered and potentially revised. So this was obviously untrue, and I would say the methodology of just that you come to this conclusion based on reading a bunch of papers is not exactly testing to see whether or not there is actually any advantage. But at one point I went ahead and looked at the website, and they're still saying this, meaning the doctors in question, and they haven't revised it, although they did say, there was only the Harper Study. So I found the Harper Study, and one of the things that the Harper Study establishes was that this was actually a study that was done only with 8 athletes, transgender athletes, and there were a couple of different things. One of the things that brought this specific one to my attention was actually another video done by a different transgender YouTuber, and they cited this as evidence for why it should just be acceptable for trans athletes to compete in sport. This was listed in their citations, and one of the interesting things that it pointed out immediately was that the science for in favor of transgenders participating was actually pretty thin. Those in favor of allowing transgender athletic participation inevitably point to the fact that every major sporting organization to look at the issue since 2004 has agreed to allow transgender women to compete against other women. Proponents also will often suggest that science is on their side. Okay, I ran into a lot of that. However, the only existing published study related to transgender women in sport is the original one by Gorin and Bunk. The science supporting transgender inclusion is very thin indeed. Look at that again. The science supporting transgender inclusion is very thin indeed. So, now mind you, this is also, this is before her study and before the other studies, but this line in particular kind of points to the fact that there actually isn't a lot of science, and even points out that proponents often suggest that the science is on their side, which is a contradiction to reality at that point, even more so now, which I'll get into with some of the other studies that I've found. In addition, the Harper Study also noted that these results are only valid for distance running. Transgender women are taller and larger on average than reference to chromosome women, and then once again looked at the old study from 2004, and these differences probably would result in performance advantages in events in which height and strength are obvious precursors to success, events such as the shot put and the high jump. Conversely, transgender women will probably have a notable disadvantage in sports such as gymnastics, where greater size is an impediment to optimal performance. So even this methodology points out that there are still going to be things that are different regardless, just because they, went through puberty as biological male. It should be noted that this conclusion only applies to distance running, and the author makes no claims as to the equality of performance pre- and post-gender transition in any other sport. As such, the study cannot unequivocally state that it is fair to allow transgender women to compete against 46XX women in all sports, although the study does make a powerful statement in favor of such a position. It makes the statement, but they point out, obviously that they didn't even really cover that. So you have a study involving 8 people, only in distance running, and she did quote the previous 2004 study that I did not include here, but to kind of give some information about that, the 2004 study was not actually undertaken on athletes at all, and that was the basis for the 1 year of hormones that was suggested. So I actually went ahead and paid for the study that the 2 Guardian articles that were listed in my first video were based on, from the British Journal of Sports Medicine. Now, the people who have been arguing about my video about this have just tried to say that this isn't good science. But this study is by far superior to anything else that had been done thus far. To suggest that this is bad science, but an article that reviewed other articles in sports policies, or a study of only 8 people, is not going to in any way be on the same level as this one. So they gave some various attempts at trying to discredit this study, but it says here, we reviewed the fitness test results and medical records of 29 trans men and 46 trans women who started gender-affirming hormones while in the United States Air Force. We compared pre- and post-hormone fitness test results of the trans women and the trans men with the average performance of all women and men under the age of 30 in the Air Force between 2004 and 2014. We also measured the rate of hormone-associated changes in body composition and athletic performance. Results. Participants were 26.2 years old prior to gender-affirming hormones. Trans women performed 30% more push-ups and 15% more sit-ups in 1 minute and ran 1.5 miles, meaning 21% faster than their female counterparts. After 2 years of taking feminizing hormones, the push-up and sit-up differences disappeared, but trans women were still 12% faster. Prior to gender-affirming hormones, trans men performed 43% fewer push-ups and ran 1.5 miles 15% slower than their male counterparts. After 1 year of taking masculinizing hormones, there was no longer a difference in push-ups or run times, and the number of sit-ups performed in 1 minute by trans men actually exceeded the average performed by their male counterparts. So, ironically, trans men actually got stronger than average men at that point. So, summary, the 15 to 31% athletic advantage that trans women displayed over their female counterparts prior to the starting gender-affirming hormones declined with feminizing therapy. However, trans women still had a 9% faster mean run speed after the 1 year period of testosterone suppression that is recommended by the World Athletics for inclusion in women's events. Gender-affirming administration of testosterone in trans men decreases adiposity and increases muscle mass, thigh muscle volume, hemoglobin, grip strength, and thigh strength. Gender-affirming blockage of testosterone and the administration of estrogen in trans women, or estrogen, has the opposite effect, but trans women retain an advantage in muscle mass, volume, and strength over female controls after 1 year on estrogen. Most changes in body composition occur within the first year on testosterone or estrogen, with slower changes after time. So let's look at that again. Trans women retain advantage in muscle mass, volume, and strength over female controls after 1 year on estrogen. Run times among trans women were similar to times among cis men and faster than times among cis women prior to estrogen. Run times worsened among trans women after starting estrogen and became slower than times in cis men, but remained faster than cis women at all time points. I'm going to go over that again. Run times worsened among trans women after starting estrogen and became slower than cis men, but remained faster than cis women at all points. Tables 4 and 2. Our assessments of muscular strength are also confounded by differences in weight between our transgender participants and reference populations. For example, as a group, trans women weigh more than cis women. Thus, trans women will have a higher power output than cis women when performing an equivalent number of push-ups. Therefore, our study may underestimate in strength that trans women have over cis women. And this point here, which is probably one of the most important, is that However, exposure to testosterone during puberty results in sex differences in height, pelvic architecture, and leg bones in the lower limbs that confer an athletic advantage to males after puberty. These anatomical differences do not respond to changes in testosterone exposure among postpubertal adults. These pretreatment anatomical differences may explain why trans women retain an advantage in the 1.5-mile run times over cis women after beginning estrogen as an adult, while push-up and sit-up performance, which are less influenced by differences in skeletal architecture, decline to the level of cis women after 2 years of estrogen. So this kind of also cements what I've been suggesting, and it's also been suggested in other studies, that the effects of basically being male during puberty don't go away just because you've changed your testosterone level. And those body structure effects affect a lot of different sports differently, but in general, they're positive. If you're going to be a gymnast, obviously you want to be tiny, so there's an advantage to having no testosterone at any point. But for the most part, sports that require power and speed are always going to, people who are biologically male are always going to have an advantage, period. In this study, we confirmed that the use of gender-affirming hormones are associated with changes in athletic performance and demonstrated that the pretreatment differences between transgender and cisgender women persist beyond the 12-month time requirement currently being proposed for athletic competition by the World Athletics and the IOC. This study suggests that more than 12 months of testosterone suppression may be needed to ensure that transgender women do not have an unfair competitive advantage when participating in elite-level competition. But as I pointed out earlier, the study also pointed out that the biological effects of being male during puberty aren't going to go away no matter how much testosterone you give, basically, and how little testosterone somebody has later. So there were a couple of other studies that were actually sourced in this study, and I'll get to those next. So another scientific source, an Oxford academic article in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism. Muscle strength, size, and composition following 12 months of gender-affirming treatment in transgender individuals. I will also provide a link to this study. I didn't get the full study, but it was made clear here that thigh muscle volume increased 15% in trans men, which was paralleled by increased quadriceps. And in trans women, the corresponding parameters decreased by only 5%, so only a 5% reduction in muscle volume, while density remained unaltered. So the muscle density didn't change. And if you've done any reading on what happens to muscles while they're developing during puberty, muscle density is one of the major issues in the differences between boys and girls after puberty. So anyway, while density remained unaltered, the trans men increased strength over the assessment period, while the trans women generally maintained their strength levels. Let me read that again. While the trans women generally maintained their strength levels. Conclusions. 1 year of gender-affirming treatment resulted in robust increases in muscle mass and strength in trans men, but modest changes in trans women. These findings add new knowledge on the magnitude of changes in muscle function size and composition with cross-hormone therapy, which could be relevant when evaluating the transgender eligibility rules for athletic competitions. This article was published December 2019. One of the other claims that I keep hearing is that supposedly there is no scientific evidence that testosterone has an effect on athletic performance. This was also in the Oxford academic, but it states here, circulating testosterone as a hormonal basis of sex differences in athletic performance. I'm not going to read this whole thing because it's only partially important, other than to point out that, again, there are some people, including the people at the website of the first study that I mentioned, suggesting that they shouldn't even have to take hormones. And the erroneous claim was also made on that website that there's no evidence that testosterone affects athletic performance. Well, there is. And I'll provide a link to this study in the description of my video. So I'm going to end this video with some quotes from the Queer Dictionary, specifically on the definition of transphobia. The reason I picked this article on this topic is because in the past I've tried to point out I don't fit the criteria of somebody who's transphobic. And they would always say, well, that definition is not good enough, that definition, that's not, so I finally just came to the queer dictionary. And this seems to be one of the few that will actually shut the issue down. But transphobia is a strong dislike, hatred, sense of disgust, or fear related to trans people. I don't dislike them. I don't hate them. I have no sense of disgust about them. And I have no fear related to them. It's not what this is about. So, again, we can't just keep rewriting definitions of words to fit whatever we need at the moment. If it's not transphobic, for example, to make a video about the science involving trans participation in sports. That act in of itself, you'll notice, is not listed anywhere in the description. Okay? Some of the definitions I've seen have shown irrational dislike, hatred, or sense of disgust. There's nothing irrational about my perspective. One of the problems with the way the social justice movement has been doing things is that they demand absolute submission to whatever it is has been determined to be the current dogma. And yes, I'm using the word dogma because the whole thing does feel religious, especially if people are going to openly lie, deny the science of the situation. I want to find a solution. I'd like to be able to find a way to make this fair. And when that happens, I won't care, and nobody else will care. Nobody who isn't some crazy religious nut type. And, if that happens, I'll be right there with you telling those people to go F themselves. But, this is just about the spirit of fairness and retaining what, basically the progress that women have made and girls have made when it comes to sports. And I'm going to make another point that, again, keeps getting ignored. All of the stuff that I said earlier about hormone levels and testosterone treatments is completely irrelevant to high school sports because those athletes are not even required to take the hormones. And when people say, well, they're younger then, as I pointed out in an earlier video, the world records for high school boys exceed the world records for Olympic class women. So yeah, it's a big deal. And it hurts the cisgendered girls who are involved in those sports. So you guys can throw names at me. That's, I think, one of the biggest reasons that they do it. Nobody wants to be called transphobic. They don't want to be called homophobic. They don't want to be called racist. So we can just kind of loosely define what that means at any given moment to try to basically shame and more specifically, make people afraid to discuss this topic. That's essentially how this is being treated. We don't really debate anymore. We just call people names. And either that or we go on these really irrational, ridiculous lie campaigns of suggesting that any source that doesn't agree with us is just a bad source. Now, both the right and the left are very guilty of doing this, but one of the things that was most frustrating when I was doing these videos was all of the research I had to do wherein I just had to make sure, well, I can't use this post because they'll make this excuse. I can't use this article because they'll make that excuse. And they're still trying to make arguments now to try to discredit this study in the British Journal of Science, which at least at this point, of all the ones I've been able to find, is the best study that's ever been done with the most transgender people participating in the study. It's not a crap study just because it doesn't uphold your worldview. And, that's kind of the nature of things going forward that I've seen, is that, unfortunately, sociology, for example, is just infected with this. And it's a lot easier to get away with this in sociology because it's much harder to conduct or debunk a sociology study. But when it comes to things that can be tabulated, that's when you have studies like this, and your dislike of the outcome of the situation is not going to work. Why don't we instead try to put some kind of effort into figuring out a way to reverse the beneficial effects of being male during puberty. That way everybody wins. Even if, this is another major point, even if we just simply went carte blanche and allowed all of the transgender people to compete as the gender they identify as, there's always going to be an asterisk next to the person's victories, even if it's not officially recorded that way. Why not try to find a way to completely level the playing field so that there is no such asterisk? And anyway, I put a lot of time into this. I pretty much spent all day researching this, and I actually even spent some actual real money to unlock all of this. If you happen to want access to this article, I have the full downloaded PDF version that I would be willing to send to you, no matter how rude you've been to me on Facebook. But it's all here. There is one final point I would like to make, which is that one of the things I've noticed, particularly when it comes to the censorship, or we need to protect people from this information rather than addressing it, it all really starts to remind me of what it was like when really religious people were struggling to keep their religion relevant. So, they would tell people to limit their exposure to outside ideas. This is also very common of cults, where you don't want to find yourself around anybody who might not agree with the cult's ideals, and then doing so is very dangerous. And unfortunately, this attitude may lead to people maintaining beliefs that don't hold up to scrutiny for long periods of time. And that's dangerous. If that's what you need to do to be able to maintain your belief structure, maybe there's something wrong with your belief structure. If you feel that people need to be protected from outside ideas, then maybe their beliefs are kind of fragile to begin with. So, anyway, thanks for listening.